Welcome to episode 38, Quantum Physics and Quantum Consciousness and the Nature of Our Reality. And I'm very, very excited to open this show with a quote back dated from 1963. Quote, when the province of physical theory was extended to encompass microscopic phenomena through the creation of quantum mechanics, the concept of consciousness came to the fore again. It was not possible to formulate the laws quantum mechanics in a fully consistent way without reference to the consciousness. End of quote by Eugen Wigner, 1963. He was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our very, very special guest again, second time here with us today, Professor Clarice Aolo. She's a quantum engineer from UCLA, 6 a.m. your time over there, I know. And Miss Bethany Adams, she's a PhD in quantum physics, calling in from South Africa today. And Malak Trabelsi-Loeb, she will welcome all of our speakers and audience today. To you, Malak.
Thank you, Han. Thank you for the introduction and greetings all. I welcome our panelists and audience who joined us from around the world here on Zoom and on our socials. I hope you enjoy the show and feel free to drop your questions and on the chat box here and comments on Facebook and LinkedIn live stream. Don't forget to follow us on our socials and to subscribe on YouTube channel, Space Connects. So back to our panel and today's anticipated subject. It is very complicated to address quantum physics, consciousness, and free will at the same time in 1 hour, since we are invoking various disciplines at once. However, many questions and hypotheses revolve around the subjects. One of the most important is how can matter, energy, and the law of physics interact to understand complex systems. Nonetheless, three possibilities may be pinned to explain consciousness and free will in order to transit to quantum physics and to enter and dive in with our panelists. First explanation was based on dualism philosophy, by which this phenomena is supernatural and it doesn't fit under the scope of physical law. The second school asserts that consciousness is a direct consequence of physical law. However, under this school, which is the materialism-based school, free will cannot be explained. And the third school is what was embraced by Sir Roger Penrose. It opened a Pandora box for various scientific debates and experiments based on the hypothesis that consciousness is resulting from physical processes that are scientifically explainable, but not yet fully understood due to missing links around quantum mechanics. Well, Sir Roger Penrose partnered with the anesthesiologist Stuart Hamroff, everyone knows about, debates and criticism arose around this subject. Once the quantum physics missing links related to living organisms are found, the ultimate questions of all questions within this subject would be answered. Here I quote Professor Clarice Diaiello, our guest today, from her keynote that I researched at the Mindshare LA conference. It came from Nanospace, the conference name, it came from Nanospace. The question, I quote now Professor Clarice, she said, the question that my group and other people are trying to answer is, can quantum physics be established or refuted to account for a relevant biological phenomena, and most importantly, be manipulated, be controlled for technological and therapeutical advantage? The answer to these questions can harness quantum computing in room temperature and human exposure to radiation, which is very crucial to space travel and Mars settlement, and many other questions to be asked during our Q&A. I welcome Professor Clarice Diaiello the second time she's with us. She is an amazing person, of course, and she is a quantum engineer interested in how quantum physics informs biology at the nanoscale. She is an expert on nanosensors harnessing room temperature quantum effects in noisy environments. Professor Aiello received her PhD from MIT in electrical engineering and held postdoctoral appointments in bioengineering at Stanford and chemistry at Berkeley. She joined UCLA in 2019, where she leads the Quantum Biology Tech Qubit Lab. Professor, it is an honor to have you. I follow you everywhere you go. I am so much into what you do, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you, Malak. Thank you, Hian. It's so nice to be back here. It's a big pleasure. Please call me Clarice. And Malak, one thing that you didn't mention is that I'm born and raised in Brazil, so that's where
I knew
my accent is from. So, and good morning. I'm drinking my coffee here. Oi, it's 6 a.m. in California. Good morning to the Europeans, to the South Africans. So, um, as Malak was saying, I am interested in potential quantum knobs that are present within living organisms and how we can control them. So, by training, I developed high tech instrumentation in order to try exactly to do this, to observe and uh, control quantum phenomena in biology, of which we think there are many examples that have been already established. And I'll get to mind and consciousness in a moment. But for instance, um, it's sort of known now that organisms such as birds and butterflies, that they follow the magnetic field of the Earth uh, when they migrate, when they go north to south, from winter to summer, at least as a partial cue. And it's thought that this happens via a quantum mediated mechanism, a mechanism involving spins, which is a merely quantum property of some particle that has to do with how those particles interact with magnetic fields. Other things, photosynthesis, the way that plants capture the photons, the energy from the sun in order to make energy. It's also thought that it's quantum mechanics mediated. The way that your metabolism works too, right? There's an abundance of potential of quantum phenomena for which there's partial evidence that they actually play a very important role in how organisms interact with their environment. So, which brings us to the subject of this talk here, which is, I think, the last frontier, that of consciousness, right? And I'm going to state my opinion. I do think that consciousness might be fully explained when we learn more about quantum phenomena in biology, right? And I do think, like Professor Penrose does, and I'm curious to see how Bethania or other awesome panelist is going to position herself. But I do think that uh, if we start interrogating organisms and uh, and biological systems in general using high tech quantum instrumentation, uh, we're going to find quantum mechanical phenomena at play. And I think that one important question when we think about consciousness is like, how do we, if consciousness is the result of a physical process, how is consciousness and memory stored, right? And I do not think that people have a very good answer to this question, but uh, Some people think, and again, there's partial evidence to that. I'm not sure we're there yet, but we're thinking about experimental ways of addressing it in our lab. Some people think that, not even talking about free will yet. So I think free will is more complicated, but consciousness, uh, it's the result of, some people think that consciousness might be the result of quantum phenomena living in our brains. In particular, uh, if our brains can sustain quantum mechanical phenomena for longer than is expected for quantum phenomena to survive at hot temperatures, right? There's a reason why, if you think about quantum computing, technological quantum computing, there's a reason why Google's wonderful quantum computer lives in a vacuum in like at cryogenic temperatures, right? Because everything that starts quantum dies classical, and the loss of quantumness is retarded by organized environments, by very low temperatures when there's very little thermal motion, for instance, right? And uh, in biology, and that's a problem for quantum in biology. Biology is the realm of wet, hot, messy environments in which one shouldn't expect quantumness to survive for any longer period of time that might be enough for that object to do something interesting, right? So I believe that one of the things that are going to come up in the near future is like, I believe that biological systems might have some geometric or some structural symmetries that might be able to protect quantumness for long. I don't fully subscribe to Professor Penrose's theory on how consciousness arises. He talks about a quantum mechanical process that happens in microtubules, which are very long, tiny little tube-like structures that are present in many, many cells in our body. And he says that these tiny little structures have the possibility of triggering a quantum mechanical process. I am not sure I'm there yet. I don't subscribe to that yet, but I think that Professor Penrose got to something very interesting because microtubules have very special geometric properties. They're very symmetric. And I think that symmetry in general in biology might be a way of, just because it's a little bit less messy, like the fact that Penrose is positing that things happen in a tube, uh, right, and not like in a mushy sort of soup of the cell. I think it's important, and I think that symmetries, and I would like to know what Bethany thinks as well. I think symmetries, geometric symmetries in molecules and like slightly more ordered structures inside biology might provide ways for quantumness to live longer. And I think that that's our goal in our lab. And I believe that uh, again, consciousness is uh, uh, probably there's probably some quantumness when we think about how memories form and are stored. But I think we're far from unveiling this experimentally, right? I think that, and that's where we want to be in our group, say in 20 years or so. And we think that we can build technological instrumentation like step by step in order to get there at some point. I will refrain from telling anything about free will. I am not sure how free will is related to to consciousness and quantum mechanics, I'll stop my contribution there, and I'm super happy to engage in more discussion, and I'm really looking forward. So, to disclosure things, Bethany and I and Professor Petrucciani, her advisor, we've been collaborating for a year or so, and she's one of the most special students that I know, and I'm really looking forward to know what she thinks about all of this physics and consciousness business.
Thank you so much, Professor Clarice. Actually, yeah, I have so many questions for you later on regarding what you are doing with the living. So yeah, I will be back to you after we go through Bethany presentation. So amazing. Thank you so much. You always have amazing insights, and I have so many questions for you. So I will be back to you. All right. Thank you so much. So we move to see a nice presentation from Mrs. Bethany Adams. She is joining us from South Africa, and Professor Clarice, she already talked about you, and she said you are one of the special students that she knows. So this is very, very nice to hear. So Mrs. Bethany Adams, she is doing her PhD in quantum physics as part of the Center for Quantum Technology based at the University of KwaZulu Natal in Durban. I think I'm not mistaken with the name. So in South Africa, of course, her research focuses on the possibility that quantum effects play a role in biological systems. And she is particularly interested in whether quantum effects might play a role in how the brain works. So welcome to the show, and it is a pleasure to have you with us today. It's always a pleasure to see ladies in quantum, ladies in technology. It's heartwarming for us to see more women into sophisticated technology, and they are there leading the way. So the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that vote of confidence, Clarice. I don't know if I can live up to that. I think the more I know about quantum mechanics, the less I understand it, never mind consciousness. Let me just share my screen. I might repeat some of the stuff that we just heard, but hello everyone, and thanks so much for letting me present here. I'm very glad to be here. As you've already been told, I'm a PhD student in the Centre for Quantum Technology at UKZN in Durban in South Africa. And I'll be talking about quantum physics and consciousness and whether the two are possibly linked in any way, at the very least on a physiological level. Yes. So before discussing whether quantum physics and consciousness are linked, I should probably be a bit clearer on what I mean by each of these, at the very least in the context of this talk. Quantum biology is a field of research that investigates whether quantum effects play any role in biological systems. And because we are talking about consciousness, which means we will probably talk about the brain, I wanted to make it clear how quantum biology relates to the brain on a physiological level. So I've summarized here three quantum effects that possibly play a role in the biological context and then the neurological context as well. So despite arguments that quantum effects wouldn't feature in biology due to, as Clarice has mentioned, the hot, wet, messy environment and decoherence, there has been some success in demonstrating coherent energy transfer in photosynthesis. And recently, researchers have applied this knowledge to electron dynamics in neurons. Quantum tunneling has also been suggested to play a role in enzymes and DNA, and also olfaction, which is the sense of smell. And more recently, researchers have applied this theory to neurotransmission in nerves. And finally, the spin dynamics of radical pairs, which Clarice also mentioned briefly, has been used to explain some of the behavioral aspects of how birds migrate. In the context of the brain, correlated nuclear spins, which is slightly different, in Posner molecules have been put forward as a mechanism for entangling neurons. I've gone over this very quickly, but don't worry, I'll get back to these specific examples in more detail. So I'm definitely no expert on consciousness, but from what I can tell, there seems to be a general acceptance that there are easier problems and then there's the hard problem. The easier problems are ones that can be mapped to actual physical processes, such as the firing of nerves or the action of neurotransmitters. The hard problem, on the other hand, comes from the difficulty of how we explain our experience of being conscious in the world, of having experiences that feel like something. My presentation today and my research is very much in the category of easier problems. I definitely wouldn't call it easy. I'm looking at physiological effects in the brain or nerves, so like electron transport and receptor binding. So what links this to consciousness is the way in which these processes, the ones under investigation, like the action of anesthetics or the binding of neurotransmitters, cause changes in consciousness. I will touch only briefly on the bigger question of consciousness right at the end of this talk, but thought I would motivate here why I think these easy problems point us in the direction of the hard problem. I read a really interesting study the other day that showed that the common painkiller Tylenol, it didn't only relieve physical pain, but also existential pain, coming from, for example, considering your own death. Research suggests that this is because physical and existential pain share common neural pathways. So maybe understanding the physical mechanisms of a body in pain will give us an insight into what it is to be somebody in pain. As we already were introduced to, the first substantial theory to link quantum physics and consciousness was orchestrated objective reduction, which was first formulated in the 1990s. Roger Penrose, a physicist famous for his work on relativity and cosmology, and for winning last year's Nobel Prize for Physics, published a book called The Emperor's New Mind, in which he suggested that consciousness cannot be completely explained classically. What wasn't clear was where to locate these quantum effects physiologically. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, suggested that microtubules, as Clarice has already described, these long filaments in cells, could possibly support quantum effects. While I don't have time to go into the theory here, there's a substantial review, 2014 review, that is worth reading. In the next few slides, I will focus less on consciousness than on quantum enhanced neural processing, we might call it. So because we're talking about quantum enhanced neural processing, it is useful to have an idea of what a nerve actually is or looks like. Some of the details of a nerve cell that will be important to this discussion are as follows. The microtubules, which we've already heard about, they make up the cytoskeleton of the cell and they're important in cell structure, in transport and cell division. Mitochondria, which are the site of electron transport chains and our metabolism, and are also the primary site of biophotons, which I will mention very briefly, and synapses, which allow nerves to communicate between each other. I'll now discuss the various quantum effects that have been proposed to take place in this neural context. So one of the key topics in quantum biology is photosynthesis. A large part of the success of quantum biology has been describing how energy or electrons move through a biological medium such as a leaf. In particular, it's been suggested that this movement uses quantum coherence. To simplify things, at least as I understand it, this means that when energy is transferred between pigments known as chromophores, which chromophores react to light, the energy is shared or delocalized over sets of chromophores. In the diagram, the chromophores are those molecules in the black circle. Each colored smaller circle represents those chromophores that share energy, whereas between the colors, energy is transferred classically. What I'm trying to illustrate in this slide is how quantum neurobiology, if we could call it that, has borrowed from work done in quantum biology. Once again, we're interested in how energy or charge moves through a biological medium, but in this case, our biological context is microtubules in nerve cells rather than antenna complexes in plants. So tubulin proteins, which together polymerize to make up these long filaments called microtubules, have similar arrangements of chromophores to photosynthetic networks. This has led researchers in quantum neurobiology to suggest that not only do microtubules allow for coherent energy or charge transfer in neurons, but also that this might be a possible explanation for how anesthetics work by disrupting this coherent electron transfer. So quantum tunneling, which I mentioned at the beginning, appears to play a role in various biological contexts. I've mentioned enzymes and DNA and olfaction. To give you a better idea of what this means physically, I thought I'd discuss the concept in the general biological context before moving on to the neural context. The lock and key mechanism or docking mechanism has been used to describe a host of the workings of biological systems like enzymes or olfaction. The way this works is that the shape of a molecule fits into a receptor that has a matching shape, and the correct fit activates the receptor. But it's now also been suggested that olfactory receptors, which are known as G protein coupled receptors or GPCRs, might be activated by the specific vibrational modes of specific odor molecules using vibration-assisted quantum tunneling. So very simplistically, this means that in order for a receptor to activate, you need an electron to move from one level to the next level. And if the odorant has the correct vibration that matches this energy of transition, then the electron moves and the receptor is activated. As I already mentioned, olfactory receptors are GPCRs, or G protein coupled receptors. GPCRs are very important in the body. They proliferate in the body, and many pharmaceuticals are targeted at these receptors. And the receptors that neurotransmitters bind to on nerve cells are also GPCRs. Neurotransmitters are the chemicals that allow nerves to talk to each other. So the binding of neurotransmitters to receptors on the cell membrane of nerves opens ion channels, allows the movement of ions across the cell membrane, changes the potential of the cell, and results in neural firing. So following from work done in olfaction, there's been some suggestion that neurotransmitters might also use vibration-assisted quantum tunneling, although most of the work is still theoretical. And finally, in this last example, we're less interested in the movement of electrons than we are in their spin dynamics and how spin might translate into chemical or biological signaling. Clarice has already told us what spin is. Spin is the property of particles that makes them act like tiny little magnets in a magnetic field. It has been known for some time that spin dynamics kind of have an effect on chemical reactions. And this was adapted to explain how birds navigate in the Earth's magnetic field. This mechanism is called the radical pair mechanism, and it shows how paired electrons in a specific spin state can translate into a specific chemical product or physiological outcome. But what does the radical pair mechanism tell us about the brain or quantum neurobiology? Well, one of the hypotheses put forward as a model for a possible quantum brain also depends on a spin-mediated physiological outcome. In this case, unlike the radical pair mechanism, the interest is on paired nuclear spins, not electron spin, but the idea is similar. Physicist Matthew Fisher hypothesized a way in which the entangled nuclear spins of phosphate molecules, which phosphate molecules are everywhere in the body, could result in entangled neural firing using molecules known as Posner molecules, which is amorphous calcium phosphate. So I've told you something about the details, and probably far too quickly, about the details of possible quantum effects in the brain, but I wanted to tell you why I think this research is so interesting. I read an article a while ago about the effects that serotonin is having on a species of shrimp. And I love the story, and I end up telling it all the time. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, and particularly and most famously known as being partly responsible for what we call happiness. Many antidepressants are SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So millions of people take these drugs, and a large percentage of our water supplies are now contaminated with SSRIs. So recently it was discovered that exposure to SSRIs was having a bad effect or causing the death of a certain type of species of shrimp. This was because the shrimp, which ordinarily hid in dark water, were swimming towards the light and getting eaten. Serotonin is made from tryptophan, which is one of those light harvesting pigments. If you remember when I was talking about coherent transfer between the chromophores, well, tryptophan is one of those chromophores. Although it is sad for the shrimp, I still also think it is incredible that our consciousness, which is mediated by neurotransmitters such as serotonin, could be considered partly photosynthetic. So one of my favorite, maybe my most favorite symptom of consciousness is poetry. And I'm always happy for an excuse to include some in a presentation. The poet Sylvia Plath wrote, "This is the light of the mind, cold and planetary. The trees of the mind are black, the light is blue." What is interesting is that brains, along with cells, actually do produce light. They do give off biophotons, which are spontaneous, ultra-weak, near ultraviolet to near infrared photons. But it seems that the light of the mind is not blue, but rather red. A recent experiment found that brain slices of different species, from toad to mouse to chicken to pig, monkey, and human, when excited with the neurotransmitter glutamate, gave off biophotons, but different frequency biophotons between the species, which showed that intelligence seemed to be to correspond to lower frequency red-shifted photons. So I've discussed a bit about the physiology or the possible physiology of consciousness, but can quantum physics tell us anything beyond that? So quantum probability models have been shown to more accurately model behavior that appears irrational. So the example I really like, or found most interesting, is what is known as context effects, which is the order that you ask something in. So if you ask people whether Bill Clinton is honest and trustworthy, and then you ask them the same question about Al Gore, they'll give you a different answer if you swap the order of the questions and ask about Al Gore first. And so this is known as the context effect. But why this is interesting in the context of quantum physics is because of commutativity, which represents the order of operations in quantum physics and is a fundamental quantum principle. And for those of you who are interested in machine learning, there's also some evidence that quantum reinforcement learning models represent or model value-based decision-making way better than classical models on a psychological as well as a neural level. So this isn't my field of expertise, so I won't say anything more, but I do think it is extremely fascinating. And thank you so much for listening. Those are just my...
Thank you so much. Really, it's amazing and phenomenal. It's really, you said it's less complicated. Actually, it's very, very complicated for me, and I'm trying to go through and understand everything, and that's why I follow Dr. Clary's work, and now I will follow your work. I'm not from quantum, I don't have quantum background, but very, very triggered by this field because actually it's going to change our lives in the future, and there are a lot of risks that they are associated with it, and there is a gap in the governance and the policy, and I come from that side also. So it's very, very important. So that's why there's one, I start back to Professor Clary's first. carrying on her question that she asked during her conference, and it's can quantum physics be established or refuted to account for the relevant biological phenomena? And she gave an example, and that example is related to space. Actually, she did not say space, but related to the radiation. And when she talked about radiation, and she said, if we understand how that works, we can find solutions for radiation, or if a human is in a place where there's a lot of radiation. And here it came to me, the space travel and Mars, of course, and we are looking forward to our next evolution into outer space. So I would like to ask Professor Clarice what she thinks about that, and is there a way that now with her studies and with her field of the lab that they have, if they are going toward, let's say, new probably findings, and where she's going with that too. So like that, we know the space community that we are working on something to facilitate our existence physically and not through only machines in outer space.
So thanks for the segue, because there's this example that I've been wanting to share with the space community for long, right? So it's another example on how our understanding of potential quantum phenomena in biology might help us with space exploration. For instance, weak magnetic fields have been shown in the lab to alter how embryos develop, how crop grows. And let me give you and how your metabolism works. Let me give you an example. Earth's natural magnetic field is about 50 microtesla in strength, which is crazy small. Like the magnet that you have in your fridge is, I think, orders of magnitude stronger than that. And when you hold your mobile like this, the magnetic field that you feel is way stronger than the magnetic field of the Earth. However, when you remove that tiny magnetic field, it seems, again, there's partial evidence that things go amiss. I have a friend in Munich. His name is Peter Vierlinger. He's like a hardcore physicist, instrumentalist. And what he does for a living is build very good hypomagnetic chambers that are chambers that are protected against external magnetic fields, so that if the magnetic field of the Earth is 50 microtesla, inside his chambers he has residual magnetic fields of nanotesla. It's really tiny, right? And he and another group, the group of Professor Butker in Mainz, they've been playing a little bit with growing things inside this magnetic field chamber, right? And what they can do is they have this chamber, and they can either put things inside with no magnetic field, or inside they can apply a tiny magnetic field where they want. And it's an N of 2. This experiment has been repeated twice. But what they see is that when they grow tadpoles for 2 days inside this chamber with an applied field corresponding to the magnetic field of the Earth, the tadpoles are okay. When they grow the tadpoles only with the residual field strengths, like nanotesla, very tiny, there's a lot of, after 2 days, there's a lot, about 30% of tadpoles that are malformed. They're not okay in some way. Okay, so given the strength of the magnetic field, given the fact that those are such tiny magnetic fields, or the absence of such a tiny magnetic fields, it's a good hypothesis that the tiny magnets of spins, it's a good suggestion that quantum properties via spin, this spin property, are actually at play there, which would signify, I mean, there's more studies at the nanoscale that are needed, but the macroscopic observation is the absence of tiny magnetic fields, or even the shift of tiny magnetic fields affects physiology like big time. So the question that I ask, and that I'm really looking forward to talking to the people in the space community, is like, what's the magnetic field in Mars, right? Can we grow lettuce in Mars? Can we survive in Mars from the point of view of embryonic development, or cellular processes that might be affected by those tiny magnetic fields, right? Or not only in Mars, in other habitable planets, and in other and during space travel, right? What sort of magnetic fields are felt by astronauts when they travel through space, right? And how is the absence or presence of slightly different magnetic fields going to affect how we develop, how we grow food, right? So I think that's one thing that I want to mention. And in the near future, that's one of the things that we think we can start trying to systematically look at in the lab, right? We can also, I mean, we would like, one of the things that we want to do is reproduce this experiment at very, very tiny scales, like reproduce the experiments of what magnetic fields or the absence thereof does to cells under a microscope. And that's actually one of the things that we're doing. We're building glorified microscopes with coils so that we can look in real time what happens for cells as they interact with magnetic fields in very systematic ways. So that's one thing.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, we have a lot of people from the space community that they are into this, and I'm sure they will reach out to you. Yeah. So, Bethany, do you have something to add to this question?
Just that I think it's not only physiological, but I think psychological as well. I mean, magnetic fields have been shown to change alpha waves in brains. They've also, and I think one of the mediating molecules that cause these changes are known as reactive oxygen species. And you can change reactive oxygen species population with magnetic fields. And they not only have physiological effects, they used as signaling molecules, they also have psychological effects. So I think, yeah, I think knowing how you're going to feel mentally in space will be important too.
Yeah, I had a question is, can the magnetic field be used to suppress stress in astronauts?
Well, I know they do use, they are using transcranial magnetic therapy for depression, but I think if you were targeting the problems brought on by reactive oxygen species, which contribute to things like inflammation, I think the magnitudes of your magnetic fields might be different. I'm not sure the magnitude of them. I mean, as Clarice was saying, these are really small magnetic fields, whereas I'm not sure about the ones that they use for transcranial magnetic stimulation for depression. So, but I do think they are a tool in the way of dealing with space.
Perfect. And the other, sorry, yes, Professor Clarice, it's yours.
No, and I think that one, just piggybacking on what Bethany said, I think it's so all those things like transcranial stimulation and other things. My impression is, after talking with experts, is that people don't fully understand how those things work at the nanoscale, right? And I think it's time that we start taking seriously like this field of bioelectromagnetics, right? It's like the influence of electromagnetic fields, be them electric or magnetic, onto like living cells. There are there's like literature and anecdotal evidence for such electromagnetic fields altering physiology for many decades now. but I think that the experiments are not reproducible or not very systematic. So in particular, that's one of the things that we're trying to do to like systematize the understanding of how organisms interact with electromagnetic fields. And I think that the only way to do this properly is by collaborating with theorists like Bethany, in the sense that they can provide the mathematical models for us to test in the lab, right, Brittany? Bethany, I don't know how you feel about it, but I think.
Yes, I also really would like to try and understand or find some mechanism for, because they're also really useful. If we could come up with electromagnetic pharmaceuticals without all the side effects of chemical pharmaceuticals, then I think that would be pretty great.
Yeah, that would be great. And actually, I recall one of your research, Professor Clarice, that you are working on, and you cited it, is the way how living organism can be quantum sensors. And you talked about flies, that you gave the example of birds and flies. And the birds, you worked on the retina to check how they are receptive to the magnetic field, I believe, during the migration. But also you gave an example, if I remember very well, it was about the flies and the way how you removed one of the protein, I believe,
Yes.
to see if they go to, they don't migrate, of course, and you said that, but they go to to sense the food or not. And actually, when the protein was back to the fly, they got they got that phenomena back. So can you explain, because
Yes.
it would be very, very important in a way to understand what you just said, for the audience and for
Yes.
everyone, how that could be channeled in order to understand our physiology and the proteins or hormones or whatever that you are working on. It could be channeled for discovery, pharmaceutical discovery for different things.
Yes, so that's not my work. I can by no means work with birds or with flies. Those are groundbreaking work done with organisms that sort of show that organisms behave consistently with this quantum mechanical model uh, of how quantum properties might be important, right? I don't work with big
Okay,
things
sorry,
at all,
sorry.
but I'll no no but I'll explain, right? For instance, as I mentioned, it's known that birds follow the magnetic field at least as a partial cue when they migrate. So during migration season, they put the birds into cages, and they shoot, they put shooting around, and then by changing the magnetic field that the birds see within this cage, the birds, they want to go out of the cage through different directions. So you can sort of manipulate how the birds behave given the local magnetic field. For the flies, right? I don't know how they do this. So flies, apparently they can be trained to find food via the presence of magnetic fields. I have no idea how they do this. For me, this is harder than quantum mechanics, but they train the flies to find the food if there is like a certain magnetic field around. So the flies find the food because they sense the magnetic field, according to the researchers who did this. But then there are certain proteins that that I thought to be involved in this process of sensing magnetic fields. One of these proteins is a protein that is actually in all our cells. It's called cryptochrome. Okay, and cryptochrome exists in our eyes. For instance, is the photoreceptor. That means that it absorbs light, that it mediates sort of vision, but it's also present in all our cells because it has circadian rhythm regulation functions. When like they help your body regulate when it's time to wake up, when it's time to sleep. And if they worked perfectly, I wouldn't need my coffee here. And the idea is that when researchers doing the experimenting flies, they knocked out the cryptochrome gene from the flies, that is made the flies no longer produce this cryptochrome protein. The flies could no longer find food via the magnetic field. They have positively lost their ability to navigate and find the food given the magnetic field cue. And what's very cool is that in a further experiment, the researchers, they put back human cryptochrome inside those modified flies, and the flies were back to finding their way to food towards the magnetic field, right? Which sort of begs, in a way, and all of this is consistent with this sort of spin mediated magnetic quantum mediated mechanism of sensing. So I think that there is enough evidence for us to start describing organisms as short-lived living quantum sensors. That's the term that I like to use, because I think there's evidence that organisms might be using quantum mechanical properties to interact with their environment, right? To sense magnetic fields, to regulate cellular metabolism and other things. And I think it's fascinating, and I think it's.
Thank you so much. I misunderstood then. You were given an example, so I thought that it was your work.
So if I may, can I say something? So, and that's sort of the thing is that, like, the examples that exist today, they're huge, right? They're like birds and like flies, and it's very hard for all of us agree that the bird behaves like this because it's quantum for a short time, right? So this is the gap that we are trying to fill in our lab. We want to do the same sort of experiments, but not with like whole birds, but maybe with like some cells and stuff to build this quantum knowledge step by step.
Perfect. It sounds fascinating. Yeah, I have one more question for Bethany, and this one is about magnetic field can be next generation of anesthesia. And this question I received it from someone on that he is around also, and he has a lot of questions here. It's Rinkesh. Yes, he's around. So he's asking about the magnetic field can be the next generation of anesthesia. Is it true or not?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if anesthetics will be able to turn off your. I mean, they have used that transcranial magnetic stimulation to switch off parts of the brain. I think they switched off a part of the brain that that made people make very unethical choices when they were faced with a choice. So maybe may have applications in terms of mind control, which is slightly alarming. And possibly it could, if the parts of the brain that target pain, if they could switch those on and off, then I suppose it could be used as a next generation anesthetic. What is interesting in terms of magnetic fields and anesthetics is that there was a recent study that looked at xenon, which is an anesthetic, and they found that different isotopes, there's 9 different isotopes of xenon. Isotopes are when the element has an added neutron. And they found that different isotopes, so most of the isotopes of xenon have a 0 nuclear spin, but there are 2 or 3, I can't remember exactly, that have nuclear spin. And they found that those which had a non-zero nuclear spin were actually far less effective as anesthetics, which is, I think, is completely fascinating. Changing something so tiny could change something on the level of how something makes you lose consciousness is pretty amazing. And spin is related to magnetic fields. So there might be other ways as well in which anesthetics might be involved with magnetic fields. So.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, we have some questions in the box, but there's one more, because actually you talked about something is very, very sensitive to a lot of people, and to us also, because we call for ethical use of technology, and very, very important. It's one of the things that we advocate as futurists, and we advocate for our evolution, but at the same time is how we could have specific governance in order for these technologies not to be over used and used against people and against people will. And that's why the consciousness and free will came into the subject, is how it could be proved if there is, through the quantum physics or quantum mechanics, that it could happen in our brain. It can we can find a way how if it's possible with technologies and with waves, or some people, they talk about delta waves, if those can trigger our free will, means like people, they can be controlled, mind controlled, and some papers about that, and they talked about it. So how these technologies and how these findings can be really spotted, first of all, because there are a lot of things are happening, we have different countries, different nations, they are competing in order to have competitive advantage, whether they are using it in military use and so on, or against maybe people. We never know. Politics today, there is a mind control that is going on through well-oriented I don't know, media, or so this is the way how it's gone. And the thing is, like, as a scientist, do you think it's possible? If yes, how we can stop it? And is it for sure it would be possible in the future? And how, as a scientist, ethical scientist, could do something in order to help stopping these behaviors from happening? Because actually, people, they look for power in certain places, and they would use things like this in order to use it against others. It's a tough question. Sorry about it.
Yeah, it is very tough, and I think it's a question that's been around since forever. So I think maybe understanding how these things work is a step in the direction of being able to recognize or regulate them. But yeah, and as you say, I think we already have ways of manipulating consciousness through the media. So maybe we need to work on those as well. But Clarice was telling us an interesting story about, I think, the Brazilian. There was some
American
sound.
Embassy.
Okay. Yes. Do you want to talk about that? I don't know the story properly, so you can tell us.
Okay, so it's not about mind control, but it's about like harming organisms via tailored electromagnetic radiation, trying to tap into ways that organisms interact with electromagnetic fields in order to do harm. It was reported in the New York Times that there was such an electromagnetic attack on some American embassies in some sensitive countries in the world. And of course, there aren't many details published, but the idea is that people in those embassies, they start feeling bad, and like they had nosebleeds, and they weren't in their best, and they didn't understand really what was happening. And the New York Times pointed out that it had to do with some sort of engineered electromagnetic radiation, okay, that Bethany, I think that in the beginning they thought it was a sound, and I think that in the end the New York Times said that it was like engineered microwave, that they basically, someone found ways of disturbing physiology with exposure to radiation that was tailored in a certain way to cause harm. And I totally agree with Bethany that we need to understand those things, right? Because the researchers need to understand this, and someone needs to regulate those things too, as a whole, right, in the planetary scale, because it's a weapon. It might be turned into a weapon. No, Bethany, what do you think?
Yeah, I do. But I also think that we need to address consciousness on the scale of media and stuff first, because maybe that will lead to more ethical choices in our in our use of weapons.
Yeah, actually, when the subject was proposed, is like consciousness and quantum physics and whatever. Some people, they would think that it's about mysticism or it's about quick pace or something. But it's very, very important, because actually futurists, what they see the future, they see the pattern of technology, how it's going, and they see the risk and where the risk is. So it's very important to shed light on these things, because actually what we also do is publicize, make these technology known to the public, in order to be aware and not be misled maybe, or going into some misleading information through the media, which is media actually, they are saying things that we don't know what is right and what is wrong anymore in the media. So who would believe? So this is why we are talking about quantum, and consciousness was one of the topics, to understand exactly what would be at stake. And this problem is one of them, and it happened, and it came from the embassy issue. And some people, they did not even believe it. They did not believe that what happened. So now Professor Clarice, she's one of the leading professors who understand very well this field, and she's also saying that it could be, and you too, Bethany, and hopefully to find out more, and hopefully scientists, they come out of their silence and speak about things more into media, and not just in their labs. So this is very important for our future, and for the future for our kids and the next generations. So ethical use of technology is very, very important, and this is very, very important to be addressed by nations and by governments, because some fields are still open, not into regulation right now, because actually in the absence of regulation, anything can happen. And what they do, they want to scale up, and they are competing, because the game theory of William Nash, and actually they don't want to bind themselves with something in order to make a competitive advantage. So I hope that I did not say the name wrong. So anyway, Hen, do you like to go forward and check with Yara for the questions, or you want to?
Sure. Let's start with a few questions from the audience. Dr. Mohan asked, what are the near-term impacts of quantum biology on biopharma industry?
Do you mean biopharma as in pharmaceutical, or?
I believe so, yeah.
I think it's quite exciting. I think there's all sorts of new pharmaceutical interventions that could come out of it. I think they've used quantum dots to treat Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, to undo the protein clumping. They use photobiomodulation, which is the application of infrared to red light to treat things like a brain injury from stroke, mental illness, even to improve learning and executive function. They've used, I just read, and I'm not sure if the effects are quantum, but I just read an article where they used ultrasound, focused ultrasound, to wake up 2 patients that had been in a coma. So I think it's a whole new level of pharmaceuticals that aren't purely chemical, which I think is really exciting, because they might have, I know these GPs, these G protein coupled receptors I was talking about, when you give one drug that's supposed to target one of them, you don't know if they might target other GPCRs, and so you get this host of side effects. So maybe there'll be less side effects with these new pharmaceuticals, hopefully based on quantum bio principles. I don't know if Clarice has anything to add.
Thank you, Bethany. Clarice, would you like to elaborate here? Or
I totally agree with what Bethany is saying, and I think that many of the things that we've discussed here is like quantum dependent chemistry that happens inside organisms. And I think that the more we learn about quantum dependent chemistry, we might start using, again, tailored electromagnetic radiation towards driving physiology in a way that we want. And I think this can be important for the pharma and the healthcare industry. Think about like a place where people can enter and receive tailored electromagnetic radiation that does something towards improving their disease or physiology in some way. I think that's exciting.
thank you, Clarice. Manuel from LinkedIn, he has wondered if consciousness could be explained as a discontinuity in quantum states. If we assume that the universe progresses from one quantum state to the next based solely on quantum mechanic rules, if we have free will, is that our ability to break the quantum causality?
Clarice, this is all yours.
Clarice, all yours.
I don't know. I don't think we know.
All right, we'll move on to
yeah, I wouldn't be able to give you a decent answer on that.
do the position of planets affect magnetic fields? I'd say yes.
Do you think the polar water and hemoglobin iron with heart pumping creates a magnetic field of human body and external field impacts and spin orientations? That's the second question from Reen Kesh. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right.
I'm not sure what polar water is, and like, I think that in general, I am curious whether things that charges that move in cells, like electrons being transported, or like fluxes of ions in ion channels being moved. I am very curious as to whether those transient movement of charges that are definitely creating a magnetic field, whether this magnetic field is being sensed by proteins or by spins in the cells in some way. That is, can there be a cellular signaling mechanism by magnetic fields coming from electron movement or ion channel movements? The idea being that if there are spins nearby in proteins that respond to magnetic fields, like those magnetic fields from a tiny distance, right, can be huge. So are chemical mechanisms in the cell being affected by those nanoscopic magnetic fields? I'm very curious about this question, actually.
Thank you, Clarice. Last question from Barbara.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, because I mean, for me, quantum is quite abstract. So how we can apply this in art or creativity of everyday artists, I would say, in the future perhaps, or now, I don't know. So you have nice literature about that, but I wanted to ask, what do you think? Thank you.
I think that art and creativity is maybe the creation of meaning, and for me, which was a little bit of a revelation in quantum theory, though maybe I'm understanding it wrong, and because I still don't completely understand quantum theory, is the double slit experiment with electrons, which I think is so amazing, because I always thought that you always hear that quantum mechanics is random, and at first it looks like it, because they did the double slit where they sent an electron through these slits, and at first it looks completely random, where these electrons are landing at the screen at the back, but slowly it builds up, and then you see the pattern emerge. And it kind of struck me that that quantum mechanics is not random as much as cumulative, and that the pattern emerges by repetition. And for me, so does meaning. Meaning is cumulative as well. If you do something once, it doesn't really feature. If you do something twice, maybe it's coincidence. But if you do it more than that, then it becomes meaningful. So for me, if art is about making meaning, then maybe that's a way of thinking about how quantum physics and art could be put together.
Well, thank you everyone for these insightful questions and for your active participation in this show. So we hope perhaps in the future show we can answer more of the quantum consciousness questions. So it was very, very insightful, your insights as a quantum engineer in quantum physics. So we wish you all the best for your future research. And thank you everyone for participating today, and we'll welcome you next week. That'll be a Puerto Rican Planet Hunters show, The Search for Life on Other Worlds, with Professor Abel Mendez and Romy Rodriguez Martinez from Puerto Rico. So thank you everyone, and have a beautiful weekend.